This is my presentation on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So to start off, some background information. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the height of tensions between the USSR and the United States during the Cold War. It was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. It was fought over the debate of nuclear weapons stationed in Cuba by the Soviet Union, and it only lasted for 13 days, which is only 2 weeks, but it was the most stressful 2 weeks of the entire Cold War. And here's a video that sums up the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis perfectly. The beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, it stemmed from the failed invasion of Cuba in 1961 by the Kennedy administration, also known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the partnership between Castro and Khrushchev in mid-1962 kind of stemmed from that, so they gained a better relationship after the failed invasion. There was also an agreement reached to place Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba after this agreement, heightening tensions. And then on October 14th, 1962, the first nuclear weapons were spotted in Cuba by U.S. U-2 spy planes. Here's a picture of the U-2 spy plane footage captured in 1962. Next comes a Heimler's history sample multiple choice question.
So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, well then let's get to it.
Kennedy had multiple options, but here are 4 of them. Which one would you choose? Would you choose A, a full-scale invasion of Cuba, B, diplomacy with Castro and Khrushchev, C, an air attack on Soviet missile sites, or D, a naval blockade? Well, if you said A, B, or C, you're wrong. Dead wrong. But if you said D, you'd be right. That's what Kennedy did, and that's how history was made. So Kennedy consulted his advisors and got mixed feedback. On October 22nd, the middle ground was solved as Kennedy decided to go for a naval blockade instead of a more radical or not enough movements by some of his advisors. Kennedy used the word quarantine instead of blockade, as blockade sounded like an act of war and he wanted it to sound a little bit nicer. On October 22nd, that same day, the U.S. sent a letter to the USSR saying that weapons in Cuba would not be permitted and demanded that Soviets dismantle nuclear operations in Cuba. Kennedy addressing the citizens. So when he addressed the U.S. citizens, his stern tone was used and included the word quarantine. He said that any nuclear launch from Cuba against any Western Hemisphere nation would be an attack on the U.S. by the Soviet Union. So he's saying if you attack any of us, you're attacking us. And then the military readiness status moved up to DEFCON 3, and it was at DEFCON 4 previously. Here is a snippet of Kennedy's address to the nation.
That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
To the topic of DEFCON. If you don't know what DEFCON is, it was the ranking system used for military activation in nuclear war. So here on the right you can see a chart. DEFCON 5 being the most chill, DEFCON 1 being basically nuclear war. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was the first time ever when DEFCON 2 was reached. So Soviet ships versus the blockade. So Khrushchev determined that the blockade was an act of aggression, even though Kennedy called it a quarantine, and said that Soviet ships going to Cuba would proceed as normal. Some ships turned around after Kennedy's blockade. Some were stopped, but were not found to be carrying harmful weapons, and some just straight up went through. So it was a success in some ways, but Khrushchev didn't care in some ways also. So the stalemate in moving towards peace. Kennedy realized that the only way that missiles would be removed would be to force an attack on Cuba. But he didn't give up yet, and the U.S. didn't give up on the diplomatic efforts between the Soviet Union and the United States. So on October 26th, an ABC News correspondent reported to the White House about talking with a Soviet agent about a possible peace agreement, which could possibly end the stalemate that had been going on for around 14 days in the Cold War previously. So, had a compromise been reached? On October 26th, Khrushchev sent an emotional message to Washington regarding the peace offers, and then the next day, on October 27th, Khrushchev sent another message to say that removing missiles from Turkey must be included in the agreement. That same day, as the peace offerings were talked about between the two nations, a U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down in Cuba, so the U.S. prepared for a Cuban invasion anyways. So that really harshened the relationship between them as it was getting better. But Kennedy disregarded the second letter and only responded to the first, saying that they wouldn't attack Cuba if missiles were removed under U.S. authority. So on October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba in a public announcement to the Soviet Union people. The aftermath. So what happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, the naval quarantine continued until IL-28 bombers were removed from Cuba, and stuff lasted a little bit after it, but not too much longer. On November 26, 1962, the naval blockade ended, and on April 1963, the U.S. Jupiter missiles were removed from Turkey. So what did this bring? Kennedy's image was strengthened, especially after the Bay of Pigs disaster, and direct communication between the two sides was reached, known as the Red Phone as well. So to conclude, the Cold War tensions were at an all-time high. Brinkmanship was clearly present. Both sides were willing to go to the brink to get what they wanted. Both sides eventually ended up compromising, and peace between the two superpowers was somewhat reached after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's my thesis statement, and here are my sources. Thank you for listening.